My grandson called me trash at dinner. He never expected the call I made after I walked out. My grandson looked me dead in the eye, in front of the whole family, and called me trash. Not under his breath. Not as a joke. He said it loud enough that the waiter refilling water glasses stopped moving. And the worst part? Nobody at that table said a single word in my defense. So I folded my napkin, stood up and walked out of that restaurant without saying goodbye to anyone. What none of them knew was that by the time I reached my car, I had already made the one phone call that would change everything for my grandson, and by the next morning, his entire world was going to look very different. Before I tell you what happened, I want to say hello properly. My name is Donna, I'm 74 years old, and if you're new here, I like to think of these little talks as sitting on my porch with a cup of coffee, telling you the truth about things that happened to me the way I'd tell a good friend. If you're enjoying this one, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe, because it helps more than you'd think for an old woman with a story to tell. And while you're at it, type in the comments where you're watching from tonight. I love scrolling through and seeing all the different towns and countries where people are curled up listening to me talk. Now let me tell you about the dinner that changed everything. I raised my daughter alone. Her father left when she was 4, and I worked 2 jobs, days at a dental office answering phones, and nights cleaning offices downtown, until she was old enough that I didn't have to anymore. I never remarried. I never really wanted to. I built a small but steady life, and by the time I turned 50, I'd saved enough, invested carefully enough, and paid off my little house on Larkspur Street enough that I could finally breathe. My daughter grew up, married a decent man, and gave me the only grandchild I would ever have. I named him in my heart before he even had a name on paper. I loved that boy from the second the nurse put him in my arms. His name is Colton. And for the first 20 years of his life, I would have walked through fire for him. I babysat him every weekend so his parents could work extra shifts. I paid for his baseball cleats, his school trips, his first car insurance policy when his parents couldn't stretch the budget. When he wanted to go to a private university instead of the state school, I was the one who quietly wrote a check nobody else in the family even knew about, because I didn't want him carrying debt the way I once had. I never once asked for a thank you. I never needed one. That's what grandmothers do, or at least that's what I believe grandmothers do. But somewhere around his second year of college, something shifted in him. I noticed it in small ways. First, he stopped calling just to talk and only called when he needed something. Money for textbooks. Money for a laptop. Money for a networking trip to a city 3 states away that turned out, I later learned, to be a spring break vacation with friends. Each time I asked a gentle question about it, he'd get this look on his face, like I'd insulted him simply by wondering where my money was going. And each time, because I loved him and because I am apparently a soft touch when it comes to that boy, I gave him what he asked for. By the time he turned 24, Colton had a good job in finance, a nice apartment his parents helped him afford, and an attitude that had curdled into something I barely recognized. He'd make little comments about my house being outdated. He'd sigh when I talked too long about my garden or my church group. He started introducing me to his friends as my grandma. She's old school in a tone that made it sound like an apology rather than a fact. Still, I told myself it was a phase. Young people get full of themselves sometimes. I remember being full of myself once too, a long time ago, before life taught me better. The dinner in question was for my daughter's birthday. We'd all gathered at a nice steakhouse downtown, my daughter, her husband, Colton, his girlfriend at the time, and a few cousins. I'd gotten dressed up for the occasion, put on the pearl earrings my late mother left me, and driven myself the 40 minutes into the city because I refused to let anyone treat me like I can't manage my own life. I was proud of that drive, honestly. 74 years old and still perfectly capable behind the wheel. The trouble started over something so small it's almost embarrassing to repeat. We were talking about summer plans and I mentioned that I was thinking about redoing my kitchen. Nothing fancy, just new countertops and maybe finally replacing that dishwasher that had been dying a slow death for 3 years. Colton, without even looking up from his phone, said, "Why bother? You're not going to be around to enjoy it that much longer anyway. And none of us want that house. It's basically falling apart. Might as well save your money." The table went quiet in that uncomfortable way where everyone hears something wrong, but nobody wants to be the one to address it. My daughter gave a nervous little laugh and said his name in that soft, pleading tone parents use when they want a comment to just disappear. I sat there for a moment, stunned, feeling my face go hot. I said gently, "Colton, that's an unkind thing to say." And that's when he looked up. He set his phone down on the table, looked me straight in the eye and said, "I'm just being honest. You're going to leave that house to Mom anyway, and it's basically trash. Just like everything else you hold on to because you're too sentimental to let go. You collect trash, Grandma. You've always collected trash." The table froze. I remember the exact clink of a fork someone set down too hard. I remember his girlfriend's eyes going wide and darting toward her plate. I remember my daughter's husband opening his mouth like he might say something and then closing it again. And I remember my own daughter, the one I raised alone, the one I sacrificed everything for, simply looking down at her napkin and saying nothing at all. Nobody defended me. Not one person at that table. I want you to sit with that feeling for a second because I think a lot of you watching tonight know exactly what that silence feels like. The silence sometimes hurts worse than the words themselves. It's one thing for a young man full of himself to say something cruel. It's another thing entirely for everyone who claims to love you to just let it hang in the air like it's nothing. I didn't cry. I want to be very clear about that because I know some of you might be picturing a sweet little old lady dabbing her eyes with a tissue, and that was not what happened. I felt something colder settle into my chest. I folded my napkin very neatly, set it beside my plate, picked up my purse and stood. "Well," I said, "I suppose I'll let you all enjoy trash-free company for the rest of the evening." And I walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I simply left. Click of my heels against the marble floor of that restaurant, the only sound behind me, because apparently not one of them thought it worth chasing after me. Now, here's where I imagine most people would expect me to go home, cry into a cup of tea, and quietly nurse my wounded pride for a few days before eventually forgiving everyone because that's what grandmothers do. That's what I might have done 20 years ago, honestly. But 74 years teaches you a few things, and one of the things it taught me is that when someone shows you exactly how they see you, you'd be a fool not to believe them. I sat in my car in that parking garage for about 10 minutes, not crying, just thinking. And then I picked up my phone and called a man named Preston Ellery, who has been my estate attorney for 11 years. Now, some of you might not know this about me, so let me explain a little bit of what I never told my family, because I've always believed a woman doesn't have to announce every piece of her business to people who don't respect her. When I turned 55, and after watching a dear friend of mine get financially devastated by a family member who assumed her assets would simply fall into their lap, I decided to be smarter about my own affairs. I set up a revocable trust. I structured my finances so that nothing would simply pass to anyone by default assumption. Everything required specific, deliberate designation. My house, my savings, even the small rental property I quietly purchased 15 years ago and never told a soul about. All of it sat inside careful legal structures that I alone controlled, and could change at any time with one phone call. Colton didn't know that. None of them knew that. They had all simply assumed, the way entitled people often do, that someday everything I owned would trickle down to them, and that assumption was exactly why my daughter's husband had once made an offhand comment about when the house finally becomes ours, and why Colton felt so comfortable calling my life's work trash, because in his mind, he'd already inherited it. He was just waiting me out. So when Preston picked up the phone that night, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to make changes to my trust," I told him. Effective immediately. He could hear something in my voice because he asked if I was all right, and I told him I was more all right than I'd been in years actually because I was finally seeing clearly. I told him I wanted Colton removed entirely as a beneficiary of anything, not just the house, but the education fund I still had earmarked for his future children, the small life insurance policy that named him, all of it. I told him I wanted the rental property, which nobody in my family even knew existed, reassigned in full to a scholarship fund I'd wanted to start for years, for kids aging out of foster care, kids who never had a grandmother like me looking out for them. And I told him I wanted my house, my little house on Larkspur Street that Colton called falling apart trash, placed into an arrangement that would allow me to sell it on my own terms whenever I chose without a single soul in my family having a say in the matter. Preston, bless him, didn't even ask why. He'd represented enough families to understand exactly what kind of dinner conversation leads to a phone call like that one. He simply said, "I can have the paperwork ready for your signature by Thursday." I want to pause here and ask you something, because I always love hearing from you in the comments. If you were sitting in that restaurant, would you have said something? Would you have stood up for the person being humiliated? even if it meant an uncomfortable moment at a birthday dinner? I think about that a lot, how easy it is to let cruelty pass by quietly when defending someone else might cost us a little bit of comfort. My daughter chose comfort. I understand it in a strange way, but understanding it doesn't mean it didn't cost her everything. I went home that night, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat in my reading chair, and for the first time in years I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel like the difficult old woman who overreacts. I felt like a woman who had finally stopped shrinking herself to make other people comfortable. The following Thursday I signed the papers. It was quiet, unceremonious, just me and Preston and a notary in a small office with too much fluorescent lighting. But it felt like closing a door that had been swinging open in the wind for years, banging against the frame every single time someone walked past it. For the next 3 weeks, nobody called me. Not my daughter. Not Colton. I imagine they assumed I'd cool down on my own, the way I always had before, and that eventually I'd show up to the next family gathering with a casserole and an apology nobody deserved from me in the first place. That's the thing about people who take you for granted. They never imagine the day you simply stop showing up. The call finally came on a Tuesday evening. It was my daughter, and I could hear in her voice that something had shifted. She said Colton had gone to apply for a small business loan. He'd been talking for months about wanting to start his own investment consulting firm, and the loan officer had asked about his expected inheritance, since he'd apparently listed it as collateral security in his application, the way young men sometimes do when they've been raised to believe money will always simply appear when they need it. And when the bank reached out to verify the details with my attorney's office, as a standard procedure, Preston's office had informed them, politely and professionally, that Colton was not currently named as a beneficiary of any trust, estate, or asset under my name. My daughter's voice was shaking. She asked me if it was true. I told her calmly that it was and that I'd made those changes the same night I walked out of that restaurant, and that I saw no reason to reverse them because nothing had changed about how her son felt about me. He'd simply been reminded that words carry weight, and mine apparently hadn't carried enough for him to bother being careful with his. She cried on the phone. She apologized finally for not saying anything that night. She admitted she'd been embarrassed by her own silence for weeks but hadn't known how to bring it up. I told her I appreciated the apology, and I meant it, but an apology doesn't undo silence, it simply acknowledges it. I told her I loved her because I do deeply and always will. But I also told her that love doesn't mean I have to hand over a lifetime of hard work to someone who called it garbage to my face. Colton called me 2 days later. It was the first time in over a year he called simply to talk to me, rather than to ask for something. He was quieter than I'd heard him in a long time. He said the loan officer's questions had embarrassed him in front of his business partner. He said he hadn't meant what he said at dinner, that he'd been stressed about work and just said something stupid without thinking. I let him talk for a long while without interrupting, because I wanted to hear whether somewhere in that apology there was any real understanding of what he'd done, or whether he was simply upset about losing access to money he'd never actually worked for. I'll be honest with you, I'm still deciding. I haven't reversed anything yet. I told him that respect isn't something you get to skip and then buy back later with an apology that only came because it cost you a business loan. I told him if he wanted a real relationship with me, it would have to start from nothing the way real relationships do, built on actual visits and actual conversations and actual kindness, not obligation dressed up as love. It's been 4 months now since that dinner. My kitchen is finally getting those new countertops I mentioned that night, the ones Colton said I'd never live to enjoy. I picked out a lovely soft sage green, and every time I walk into that kitchen, I feel something close to peace. My scholarship fund for foster kids has its first 3 recipients starting this fall, and honestly, watching those letters of acceptance land felt better than anything money ever bought for my own family. As for Colton, he calls every couple of weeks now. Sometimes we talk for 20 minutes, sometimes just 5. It's not what it used to be, and maybe it never will be exactly that again. But it's honest, and for the first time in a long while, I don't feel like I'm buying his attention. I feel like I'm simply his grandmother again, nothing more, nothing less, and strangely enough, that feels like more than enough. If there's one thing I hope you take from my little story tonight, it's this: you are never too old, and it is never too late, to stop letting people mistake your kindness for weakness. I spent decades pouring myself into people who eventually forgot I was a person too, with feelings that could be hurt and boundaries that deserved respect. It took one ugly word at a dinner table to remind me that I still have a voice, and a choice, and a life that is entirely my own to protect. So if you've made it this far with me tonight, thank you for sitting with an old woman and her stories. If this one meant something to you, please hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and tell me down in the comments where you're watching from. I truly do read every single one, and it means more to me than you know to feel less alone out here. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and don't you dare let anyone call your life's work trash.